The early estimates made by the American engineers were far too low, but the French experience had taught the United States to expect such an outcome. Indeed, it is doubtful if anybody believed that the first estimates would not be doubled or quadrupled before the canal was finished. The journey of the USS Oregon around the Horn from Pacific waters to the theater of the war with Spain in the Caribbean, the theater of the war with Spain in the Caribbean in 1898 impressed upon the American public the necessity of building the canal as a measure of national defense. The journey of the USS Oregon around the Horn from Pacific waters to the theater of the war with Spain and the Caribbean in 1898 impressed upon the American public the necessity of building the canal as a measure of national defense. Commercial interests long had been convinced of its necessity as a factor in both national and international trade. And when it was realized that the Oregon would have saved 8,000 miles if there had been a canal at Panama, the American mind was made up. It determined that the canal should be built, whatever the cost. From the very first, there was never any question that the necessary money would be forthcoming. The necessary money would be forthcoming. It is a fact unprecedented in all parliamentary history that all of the appropriations necessary for the construction and completion of the Isthmian Waterway were made by Congress without a word of serious protest. During the same war with Spain, that convinced the United States that the canal must be built, must be built. A long forward step was taken in the science of medicine as concerned with the prevention and control of tropical diseases. The theory that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes had been proved by a Cuban physician, Dr. Carlos Finley, a score of years earlier, and Englishman Sir Patrick Manson had first shown that disease might be transmitted by the bites of insects. And another Englishman, Major Roland Ross, had shown that malaria was conveyed by mosquitoes. It remains, however, for American Army surgeons to demonstrate, as they did in Cuba, that yellow fever was transmissible only by mosquitoes of the Stegomyia variety and by no other means whatsoever. With this knowledge in their possession, the Americans were able to do what the French were not, to control the chief enemy of mankind in torrent climes. In the first years of the work, the public and Congress reflecting its views. In the first years of the work, the public and Congress, reflecting its views, were not sufficiently convinced of the efficacy of the new scientific discoveries to afford the means for putting them into effect. The Isthmian Canal Commission refused to honor requisitions for wire screens, believing that they were demanded to add to the comfort and luxury of quarters on the zone, rather than for protection against disease. But the outbreak of yellow fever in 1905 was the occasion for furnishing the sanitary department under Colonel W.C. Gorgas with the necessary funds, and thus provided he speedily and completely stamped out the epidemic. From that time on, no one questioned the part that sanitation played in the success of the project. The cities of Panama and Colon were cleaned up as never were tropical cities cleaned before. All the time, every day. Men fought mosquitoes. That the workers in the ditch might not be struck down at their labor. The Americans, too, made mistakes. In the beginning, they attempted to build a canal under the direction of a commission with headquarters in Washington. This commission, at long distance and by methods hopelessly involved in red tape, sought to direct the activities of the engineer in charge on the isthmus. The public was also impatient. The public was also impatient. With a long time required for preparation and insistently demanded that the dirt begin to fly, quote unquote. The work was begun in 1904. It proceeded so slowly that 2 years later the chairman of the Isthmian Canal Commission asserted that it must be let out to a private contractor. This being, in his opinion, the only way possible to escape the toils of governmental red tape. The then chief engineer, the second man who had held that position while fretting under these messes, was opposed to the contract system. Bids were asked for, however, but all of them were rejected. Fortunately, Congress from the beginning had left the president a practically free hand in directing the cause of the project. Mr. Roosevelt. Mr. Roosevelt reorganized the commission, made Colonel George W. Gettles, an army engineer, chairman of the commission and chief engineer of the canal. The constitution of the commission was so changed as to leave all the power in the hands of the chairman and to lay all the responsibility upon his shoulders. It was a master stroke of policy, and the event proved the choice of the man to be admirable in every way. From the day the army engineers took charge, there was never any more delay, never any halting progress, and the only difficulties encountered were those of resistant nature, such as the slides in Culebra Cut, and those of misinformed public opinion, such as the absurd criticism of the Gatun Dam. The Americans, too, in the early stages of the work were hampered by reason of the fact that the final decision as to whether to build a sea-level canal or a log canal was so long delayed by the conflicting views of the partisans of each type in Congress, in the executive branches of the government, and among the engineers. This problem too was solved by Mr. Roosevelt. He boldly set aside the opinion of the majority of the engineers who had been called in consultation on the problem and directed the construction of a log canal. The wisdom of this decision has been so overwhelmingly demonstrated that the controversy that once raged so furiously now seems to have been but a tiny tempest in an insignificant teapot. One other feature of the course of events under the American regime at Panama must be considered. Graft and corruption had ruined the French. The Americans were determined that whether they succeeded or not, there should be no scandal. This indeed in part explains why there was so much apparently useless circumlocution in the early stages of the project. Congress, the president, the engineers, all who were in responsible position were determined that there should be no graft. There was none. Not only were the Americans determined that the money voted for the canal should be honestly and economically expended, but they were determined also that the workers on the canal should be well paid and well cared for. To this end, they paid not only higher wages than were current at home for the same work, but they effectively shielded the workers from the exactions and exhortations of Latin and Oriental merchants by establishing a commissary through which the employees were furnished wholesome food at reasonable prices lower indeed than those prevailing at home. As a result of these things, the spirit of the Americans on the canal zone, from the chairman and chief engineer down to the actual diggers, was that of a determination to lay the barrier low, and to complete the job well within the limit of time and at the lowest possible cost. In this spirit, all Americans should rejoice, for it is the highest expression of the nearest approach we have made to the ideals upon which the fathers founded the Republic. It is impossible to leave out of the reckoning in telling the story of the canal the checkered history of the diplomatic engagements on both part of the United States, on the engagements on the part of the United States that have served both to help and to hinder the undertaking. What is now the Republic of Panama has been for the greater part of the time since continental Latin America threw off the yoke of Spain, a part of that republic, having its capital at Bogota, now under the name of Colombia, sometimes under the name of New Granada, sometimes a part of a federation including Venezuela and Ecuador. The United States, by virtue of the Monroe Doctrine, always asserted a vague and undefined interest in the local affairs of the isthmus. This was translated into a concrete interest when, in 1846, a treaty was made covering the construction of the railroad across the isthmus, the United States engaging always to keep the transit free and open. Great Britain, by virtue of small territorial holdings in Central America and of larger claims there, also had a concrete interest, which was acknowledged by the United States in the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850, under which a projected canal should be neutral under the guarantee of the governments of the United States and Great Britain. For years, the United States was inclined to favor a canal through Nicaragua rather than one at Panama, and after 1898, when the American nation had made up its mind to build a canal somewhere, the partisans of the Panama-Nicaragua routes waged a bitter controversy. Congress finally decided the issue by giving the president authority to construct a canal at Panama with the proviso that should he be unable to negotiate a satisfactory treaty with Colombia, which then owned the isthmus, he should proceed to construct the canal through Nicaragua. Under this threat of having the scepter of commercial power depart forever from Panama, Colombia negotiated a treaty known as the Heron Treaty, giving the United States the right to construct the canal. This treaty, however, failed of ratification by the Colombian Congress with the connivance of the very Colombian president who had negotiated it. But President Roosevelt was most unwilling to accept the alternative given him by Congress, that of undertaking the canal in Nicaragua. And this unwillingness, to say the least, encouraged a revolution in Panama. Encouraged a revolution in Panama. This revolution separated the Isthmus from the Republic of Colombia and set up the new Republic of Panama. As a matter of fact, Panama had but the slenderest relations with the Bogota government, had been for years in the past an independent state, had never ceased to assert its own sovereignty, and had been indeed the theater of innumerable revolutions, a theater of innumerable revolutions, theater of innumerable revolutions. The part the United States played in encouraging this revolution. The fact that the United States authorities prevented the transit of Colombian troops over the Panama Railway, and that American Marines were landed at the time, has led to no end of hostile criticism, not to speak of the still pending and unsettled claims made by Colombia against the United States. Mr. Roosevelt himself, years after the event, and in a moment of frankness, declared, I took Panama and left Congress to debate it later. I took Panama and left Congress to debate it later. Whatever may be the final outcome of our controversy with Colombia, it may be confidently predicted that history will justify the coup d'etat. On the theory that Panama was the best possible site for the interoceanic canal, and that the rupture of relations between the territory of the Isthmus and the Colombian Republic was the best possible solution of a confused and tangled problem. These diplomatic entanglements, however, as the canal is completed, leave two international disputes unsettled. The one with Colombia about the genesis of the canal undertaking, and the other with Great Britain about the terms of its operation. Congress in its wisdom. Congress in its wisdom, saw fit to exempt American vessels engaged exclusively in coastwise trade, that is to say, in trade slowly between ports of the United States, from payment of tolls in transit through the canal. This exemption was protested by Great Britain on the ground that the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which took the place of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, provided that the canal should be open to all nations on the exact and equal terms. The future holds the termination of both these disputes. Congress had never begrudged an appropriation, indulged in many disputes concerning the building and operation of the canal. First, there was the controversy as to the site between Nicaragua and Panama. Next came the question as to whether the canal should be at sea level or at lock tide. Then there was the question of tolls and the exemption of American coastwide traffic. But perhaps the most acrimonious debates were on the question as to whether or not the canal should be fortified. Those who favored fortification won their victory, and the canal was made, from a military standpoint, a very Gibraltar for the American defense of and control over the Caribbean. That this was inevitable was assured by two facts. One, that the trip of the Oregon in 1898 crystallized public sentiment in favor of constructing the canal, and the other, that the canal itself was wrought by army engineers under the direction of Colonel Goethals. Colonel Goethals, never for a moment considered the possibility that Congress would vote against fortifications, and the whole undertaking was carried forward on that basis. If the military idea, the notion of its necessity as a feature of the national defense, was a determining factor in initiating the canal project, it remains a fact that its chief use will be commercial, and that its money, return, whether small or large, nearly all will be derived from tolls, assessed upon merchant vessels passing through it.